Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up, or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. I'm going to take you inside the gin-soaked streets of Georgian London, where fortunes were made and lost in a single gulp, where children grew up knowing the taste of juniper before they could walk, and where the line between madness and sobriety became so blurred that nobody could tell the difference anymore. You'll meet the characters who profited from this chaos, the families it destroyed, and the desperate officials who watched helplessly as their city descended into alcoholic anarchy. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. It all started with the best of intentions. The government thought they were solving problems, not creating the greatest social disaster in London's history. By the end of this series, you'll understand how a simple tax policy turned into a nightmare that would define an entire generation and leave scars on British society that lasted for centuries. Let me paint you a picture of just how bad things got. Imagine walking down any street in London and seeing gin shops literally every few doors. We're not talking about fancy establishments. These were holes in the wall where you could get blackout drunk for the price of a loaf of bread. Signs hung outside reading, "Drunk for a penny," "Dead drunk for 2p," "Clean straw for nothing." That last part, that was where they'd let you sleep it off if you couldn't make it home. The numbers are staggering. In 1730, London had over 7,000 gin shops serving a population of just 600,000 people. That's one gin shop for every 85 residents, including babies and children. To put that in perspective, modern London has roughly one pub for every 1,000 residents. We're talking about a city that had turned into one massive distillery with houses attached. But this story really begins in 1688, and it starts with a Dutchman named William of Orange, who would become King William III of England. Now, William had a problem. England was at war with France, and French brandy was the fashionable drink of choice among the English elite. Every bottle of French brandy sold in London was money flowing directly into the pockets of England's enemies. William needed a solution, and he needed it fast. His answer seemed brilliant at the time. Why not promote domestic spirits instead? Holland, William's homeland, had been producing Genever, a juniper-flavoured spirit, for decades. The English took this Dutch Genever, shortened the name to gin, and William's government began actively encouraging its production and consumption. They slashed taxes on domestic spirits while keeping heavy duties on foreign imports. English distillers could suddenly produce gin cheaply and sell it everywhere. The policy worked too well. Within a few decades, gin production exploded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Small-time entrepreneurs realized they could set up distilleries in their basements and make a fortune. The barriers to entry were incredibly low. You didn't need expensive equipment, aged barrels, or specialized knowledge. You just needed some grain, a basic still, and juniper berries for flavoring. Enter Judith Defoe, a silk winder who lived in the parish of Bethnal Green. Judith's story perfectly captures how gin transformed ordinary people into something unrecognizable. She was a working woman, the kind who might have lived a quiet, unremarkable life in any other era. But this wasn't any other era. This was gin-soaked Georgian London, where normal rules no longer applied. Judith had a problem that thousands of London women shared. She was addicted to gin, but gin cost money, and money was something she rarely had enough of. On a cold January morning in 1734, Judith made a decision that would shock even the gin-hardened residents of her neighbourhood. She picked up her 2-year-old daughter, little Mary, and took her for a walk. The child had just been given new clothes by the parish workhouse, where Judith sometimes left her during the day. Nice clothes, valuable clothes, clothes that could be sold. Judith walked with Mary to a field in Bethnal Green, and there she strangled her own daughter with her bare hands. She stripped the clothes from the tiny body, left Mary in a ditch, and walked back to town to sell the garments for gin money. When the authorities caught up with Judith, she showed no remorse, no horror at what she'd done. The gin had consumed her so completely that maternal instinct, basic human decency, and self-preservation had all disappeared. At her trial, she calmly explained that she needed the money for gin and that her daughter's clothes were worth enough to keep her drunk for several days. The judge who sentenced her to death reportedly wept openly in court. Judith's story wasn't unique. It was just the most extreme example of what gin was doing to London families every single day. Children were being abandoned, beaten, sold, and murdered by parents whose minds had been completely destroyed by constant intoxication. The courts were overwhelmed with cases of gin-related violence, theft, and neglect. But the real tragedy wasn't just individual cases like Judith's. The real tragedy was systematic. Entire neighbourhoods had become uninhabitable wastelands where drunken violence was the norm and sobriety was the exception. St Giles, one of London's most notorious slums, became ground zero for gin consumption. Visitors described streets littered with unconscious bodies, children as young as 5 drinking themselves into stupors, and buildings that reeked of vomit, urine, and rotting gin. The economic incentives made everything worse. Gin sellers discovered they could maximize profits by making their product as addictive as possible. They began adding ingredients that modern chemists would recognize as crude stimulants and depressants. Oil of vitriol, which we now know as sulfuric acid, was commonly added to give gin more bite. Turpentine provided a burning sensation that customers associated with strength. Some distillers added opium to make their gin more addictive, while others used lead-based sweeteners that slowly poisoned their customers. Mary Young, known on the streets as Jenny Diver, represents another side of gin's impact on Georgian society. Mary wasn't a victim like Judith Dufour. She was an entrepreneur, a criminal mastermind, who built an empire on gin-fueled chaos. Mary realized that drunk people made easy targets, and she organized gangs of pickpockets who worked the gin shops and surrounding streets. Mary's operation was sophisticated. She trained young women to pose as customers in gin houses, identifying wealthy marks who were drinking heavily. Her girls would engage these targets in conversation, keep them drinking, and then systematically rob them blind. But Mary's real genius was understanding that gin didn't just create victims, it created customers for crime. Desperate gin addicts needed money constantly, and Mary provided them with opportunities to earn it through theft. She ran what amounted to a crime academy, teaching burglary, pickpocketing, and confidence tricks to anyone willing to share their profits with her. The gin epidemic had created a massive pool of potential criminals, and Mary Young turned that into a business model. Her network grew so large that she essentially controlled entire neighbourhoods. Gin sellers paid her protection money. Legitimate businesses hired her security services. Even some magistrates reportedly looked the other way in exchange for information about more serious criminals. Mary had turned gin-induced social chaos into personal wealth and power. The authorities were completely overwhelmed. London's police force, such as it was, consisted mainly of parish constables who were often drunk themselves. The night watch was a joke. Most watchmen spent their shifts inside gin shops, claiming they needed to stay warm during cold London nights. Crime rates soared, but conviction rates plummeted because witnesses, victims, and sometimes even judges were too intoxicated to participate effectively in legal proceedings. Meanwhile, the distilling industry was making unprecedented profits. Men like Thomas Bradshaw, who owned several large distilleries in Southwark, became wealthy beyond imagination. Bradshaw started as a small-time grain merchant. but he recognized opportunity when he saw it. He invested everything in gin production, just as demand was exploding. Bradshaw's distilleries operated around the clock. He employed hundreds of workers and purchased grain by the shipload. His gin was sold in bulk to retailers throughout London, but he also operated his own chain of gin shops in working-class neighbourhoods. Bradshaw understood that addiction was the ultimate business model. Once customers became dependent on gin, they would find money somehow, even if it meant stealing, prostitution, or selling their children's clothes. But Bradshaw wasn't content with just selling gin. He began buying up property in neighbourhoods where gin consumption was highest. When families drank themselves into debt and lost their homes, Bradshaw was there to purchase the buildings cheaply. He converted many of these properties into additional gin shops, creating a cycle where communities destroyed by gin became sources of even more gin-related profit. The human cost was staggering, but the numbers that really shocked contemporary observers were demographic. London's death rate began exceeding its birth rate for the first time in centuries. Gin wasn't just killing individuals, it was literally threatening the city's survival. Pregnant women who drank heavily often miscarried or delivered babies with severe developmental problems. Those children who survived infancy in gin-soaked households rarely lived to adulthood. Parish records from this period paint a horrifying picture. In some of London's poorest neighbourhoods, infant mortality rates exceeded 50%. Adult life expectancy dropped dramatically. Entire family lines were simply disappearing as gin consumption eliminated generation after generation. The social fabric was disintegrating so rapidly that traditional institutions couldn't adapt. Churches found their congregations shrinking as parishioners chose gin shops over Sunday services. Schools closed because children were either too intoxicated to attend or were working to support their families' gin habits. Even prisons became overwhelmed as gin-related crimes filled every available cell. William Hogarth, the famous artist, captured this decline in his series of prints called Gin Lane. His images showed a world turned upside down, where mothers dropped babies while reaching for gin, where buildings crumbled because their inhabitants were too drunk to maintain them, and where death and despair ruled every street corner. But Hogarth's art, powerful as it was, couldn't capture the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about individual tragedy or even community breakdown. This was about the potential collapse of urban civilization itself. The government officials who had created this disaster were finally beginning to understand what they had unleashed, but their early attempts at solutions only made things worse. In 1729, Parliament passed the first Gin Act, which attempted to control the crisis through licensing and taxation. The law required gin sellers to purchase expensive licenses and imposed heavy duties on gin sales. The result was predictable chaos. Legal gin shops closed overnight, but illegal gin sales exploded. Enterprising criminals realized they could make fortunes by avoiding the new taxes and licenses. Underground distilleries sprouted in cellars, attics, and abandoned buildings throughout London. The gin trade didn't disappear, it just went completely criminal. Sarah Malcolm understood this opportunity better than most. Sarah was a laundress who worked for wealthy families in the City of London, but she had been watching the gin trade evolve with the calculating eye of a born entrepreneur. When the Gin Act made legal gin selling expensive and difficult, Sarah saw her chance to enter the market illegally. Sarah's operation was brilliantly simple. She used distribution. When laundry business's cover forgied her legitimate, she collected dirty clothes from wealthy households. She would leave behind bottles of untaxed gin hidden in laundry baskets. Her customers paid by leaving money in predetermined locations, and Sarah's laundry routes provided perfect cover for regular deliveries. But Sarah's ambitions extended beyond simple gin running. She realized that her wealthy clients, many of whom had developed serious gin habits, represented opportunities for much larger profits. She began studying their routines, their security arrangements, and their most valuable possessions. In February 1733, Sarah decided to expand her business model. She murdered her elderly employer, Lydia Duncombe, along with 2 other women in the household, and stole jewellery and cash worth several £100s. Sarah's plan was to use this capital to establish a larger gin operation, but she had underestimated how thoroughly gin had compromised her judgment. Sarah made stupid mistakes that sober criminals would never have committed. She tried to sell the stolen jewellery too quickly and in too obvious locations. She spent money lavishly in neighbourhood gin shops, drawing attention to herself. When authorities arrested her, they found evidence linking her not just to the murders, but to an extensive illegal gin network. At her trial, Sarah showed the same detached indifference that characterised so many gin-related criminals of this era. She admitted to the murders without emotion and seemed genuinely confused about why people found her actions shocking. The gin had destroyed her ability to distinguish between normal business practices and horrific violence. Sarah's execution drew enormous crowds, but not because people were horrified by her crimes. They came because her story represented something they all understood. Gin had transformed ordinary London residents into creatures capable of anything. Sarah wasn't a monster. She was just what happened when gin addiction met entrepreneurial ambition. The underground gin trade that flourished after the 1729 Gin Act created new forms of violence and corruption throughout London. Criminal gangs fought territorial wars over gin distribution rights. Corrupt officials took bribes to ignore illegal distilleries. Even parish priests were rumoured to be blessing gin operations in exchange for generous donations. James Dalton embodied this new criminal landscape. James started as a small-time thief working crowds the outside legal gin shops, but when those shops closed, he adapted quickly. He organised gangs that robbed legal gin warehouses and distributed the stolen spirits through networks of illegal sellers. James's operation grew so sophisticated that he essentially controlled gin distribution in several London neighbourhoods. He employed lookouts who watched for government inspectors, enforcers who collected debts from illegal gin sellers, and even chemists who adulterated stolen gin to increase its volume and potency. But James understood that violence was bad for business. Instead of fighting rival gangs, he negotiated territorial agreements. Instead of bribing individual officials, he developed systematic corruption networks. James turned illegal gin distribution into a professional enterprise with rules, hierarchies, and business practices. His success attracted attention from London's established criminal organisations. Traditional thieves and murderers realised that gin offered more reliable profits than their older specialties. Highway robbery was dangerous and unpredictable, but gin addiction guaranteed steady customers who would pay almost any price for their daily supply. The merger of gin distribution with London's existing criminal networks created something unprecedented: organised crime on an industrial scale. These weren't random thugs committing individual crimes. These were sophisticated organisations that controlled entire neighbourhoods and influenced government policy through systematic bribery and intimidation. Government officials found themselves in an impossible position. The legal gin trade had been destroyed, but illegal gin consumption was higher than ever. Tax revenues had disappeared, but the social problems caused by gin had actually gotten worse. Criminal organisations were growing more powerful and more violent, but traditional law enforcement was completely inadequate to deal with them. Magistrate John Gonson represented the government's confused response to this crisis. Gonson was appointed to lead raids against illegal gin sellers, but he quickly discovered that enforcing the law was nearly impossible. His constables were often drunk themselves. Witnesses refused to testify because they feared criminal retaliation. Even when he successfully prosecuted illegal gin sellers, new operations appeared immediately to replace them. Gonson's raids became theatrical performances rather than effective law enforcement. He would lead dozens of constables into known gin-selling neighbourhoods, smash a few barrels, arrest some obvious criminals, and declare victory. But everyone involved understood that these raids had no real impact on gin availability or consumption. The futility of Gonson's efforts became clear during his most famous raid in St. Giles. His forces surrounded what they believed was a major, illegal distillery, only to discover that the building's owners had been tipped off hours earlier. Instead of finding gin and criminals, Gonson's men found empty rooms and mocking graffiti that read, "Gone to make gin elsewhere. Thanks for the warning." The corruption had become so systematic that criminal organizations often knew about planned raids before the constables who would conduct them. Government officials were selling information to the same illegal gin operations they were supposed to be shutting down. Elizabeth Brownrigg discovered a different way to profit from gin-induced social chaos. Elizabeth ran what was officially called a workhouse for orphaned and abandoned children, but her real business was much darker. She realized that gin-addicted parents were constantly abandoning children they could no longer care for, and that these children represented opportunities for exploitation. Elizabeth's workhouse received government funding to care for abandoned children, but she spent as little as possible on food, clothing, and shelter. Instead, she put the children to work in dangerous and illegal occupations. Young boys were sent to steal from gin shops and warehouses. Girls were forced into prostitution or used as bait in elaborate confidence schemes. But Elizabeth's real innovation was recognizing that gin-damaged children could be trained to become more effective criminals than healthy ones. Children who had grown up around constant intoxication were already comfortable with violence and chaos. They had fewer moral inhibitions and were more willing to take extreme risks. Elizabeth developed training programs that turned abandoned children into specialized criminals. Some learned pickpocketing techniques specifically designed for use in crowded gin shops. Others were taught to identify and exploit the particular vulnerabilities of different types of drunk people. The most promising students learned confidence tricks that could separate wealthy gin addicts from their remaining money. Her operation grew so successful that other criminal organizations began paying Elizabeth for trained child criminals. She was essentially running a criminal academy funded by government money intended to help abandoned children. The authorities eventually discovered Elizabeth's activities, but not because of effective law enforcement. She was caught only because she made the mistake of torturing and murdering several children whose screams attracted neighborhood attention. Even then, her trial revealed that government officials had been ignoring obvious signs of abuse for years because Elizabeth's reports always showed that her charges were being successfully rehabilitated. Elizabeth's execution provided no real justice for her victims or solutions to the problems that had made her crimes possible. Gin continued destroying families, children continued being abandoned, and other criminal entrepreneurs immediately stepped in to fill the void Elizabeth's death had created. The social disintegration was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or even understand it. London was becoming something unprecedented in human history, a major city where criminal organizations were more powerful and better organized than legitimate government institutions. Parish records from 1735 show that in some neighborhoods, over 60% of all arrests were gin-related. But arrest rates were actually declining because there simply weren't enough constables, magistrates, or jail cells to process all the gin-induced crime. The legal system was collapsing under the weight of social problems it had never been designed to handle. The economic implications were staggering. Legitimate businesses were fleeing gin-soaked neighborhoods because their workers were too drunk to be productive and their customers were too dangerous to serve. Property values collapsed as entire districts became uninhabitable. Tax revenues disappeared as economic activity shifted from legal enterprises to criminal organizations that paid no taxes and recognized no government authority. Dr. Stephen Hales, one of the few medical professionals studying gin's effects systematically, published reports that shocked even contemporary observers who thought they understood how bad things had become. Hales documented cases of children born addicted to gin, of adults who had consumed so much adulterated gin that their internal organs were literally dissolving, and of entire families who had died not from gin poisoning, but from starvation because they spent all their money on gin instead of food. But Hales's most disturbing discovery was that gin addiction hereditary in ways that went beyond simple learned behavior. Children born to severely addicted parents seemed to crave gin from birth and showed developmental problems that persisted even when they were removed from gin-soaked environments. The implications terrified anyone who understood them. London wasn't just dealing with a temporary social crisis that could be solved through better laws or more effective enforcement. The city was creating a permanently damaged population whose problems would persist for generations. The scientific evidence was mounting, but the political response remained paralysed. Members of Parliament who should have been addressing this crisis were themselves regular gin consumers. The House of Commons often reeked of juniper and turpentine, with debates frequently interrupted by members too intoxicated to speak coherently. How could a government solve a problem when its own leaders were victims of that same problem? Thomas Pelham Holles, the Duke of Newcastle and one of the most powerful politicians of his era, exemplified this contradiction. Publicly, Newcastle condemned gin as a threat to British civilization. He gave passionate speeches about the need for moral reform and stronger enforcement of existing laws, but privately, Newcastle maintained a personal gin cellar that rivaled those of commercial distillers. Newcastle's hypocrisy went beyond personal consumption. His political allies included several of London's wealthiest distillery owners, men who had contributed enormous sums to his political campaigns. When reform proposals threatened their profits, these men could count on Newcastle to find procedural ways to delay or derail legislative action. The Duke's private correspondence, discovered decades later, reveals a man trapped between public duty and private interest. In one letter to his brother, Newcastle wrote that gin was indeed destroying London, but that immediate action would bankrupt too many of his supporters. He calculated that gradual reform over many years would be less politically damaging than the shock therapy that medical experts were demanding. This political paralysis had deadly consequences. While Newcastle and his colleagues debated gradual approaches, London's gin epidemic was claiming thousands of additional victims every month effective action allowed an. The delay between recognising the problem and taking an entire generation to be lost to gin addiction. Captain Thomas Coram understood the human cost of this political cowardice better than most government officials. Coram wasn't a politician or a social reformer by profession. He was a sea captain who had made his fortune in international trade. But walking through London's streets in 1735, Coram saw something that changed his life forever. On a cold morning in March, Coram discovered the body of an infant girl abandoned in a doorway near his home in Rotherhithe. The child had frozen to death during the night, but what shocked Coram wasn't just the death itself. It was the evidence surrounding the tiny corpse. Empty gin bottles, adult vomit, signs that whoever had abandoned this baby had been catastrophically drunk when they made that decision. Coram began paying attention to abandoned children throughout London, and what he discovered horrified him. Dozens of infants were being left to die every week, and the vast majority of these cases involved gin-addicted parents who could no longer care for their children. Traditional charity organisations were overwhelmed and underfunded. Parish authorities were too drunk or too corrupt to provide effective help. The sea captain decided to take action where government had failed. Coram spent the next several years organising London's first foundling hospital, a facility specifically designed to care for abandoned children. But his real innovation was understanding that saving individual children wasn't enough. He needed to address the root causes that were creating so many abandoned children in the first place. Coram's foundling hospital became a research centre for studying gin's impact on families. He employed physicians to document the health problems of children born to addicted parents. He hired investigators to track what happened to families after gin addiction took hold. Most importantly, He began collecting evidence about the connections between gin availability and child abandonment rates. The data Khorram assembled was devastating. In neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of gin shops, child abandonment rates were 20 times higher than in areas where gin was less available. Children born to heavily addicted mothers had mortality rates approaching 70%. Even those who survived infancy showed developmental problems that persisted throughout their lives. But Khorram's most significant discovery was economic. He calculated that the cost of caring for gin-damaged children far exceeded any tax revenues generated by gin sales. The government wasn't just permitting social disaster, it was actually losing money by allowing the gin trade to continue destroying families. Armed with this evidence, Khorram began lobbying Parliament directly. Unlike other reformers who relied on moral arguments, Khorram presented hard financial data. He showed politicians exactly how much gin-related problems costing the government in increased poor relief, law enforcement, and medical care. He demonstrated that the gin trade was a net economic loss for British society. Khorram's approach initially seemed promising. Several members of Parliament expressed interest in his findings and promised to consider new legislation. But as months passed, Khorram discovered the same political obstacles that had frustrated other reform efforts. The distilling industry's political influence was simply overcome through to too powerful rational argument and factual evidence. Meanwhile, the gin epidemic continued evolving in ways that made it even more dangerous and difficult to control. Criminal organizations had learned to manipulate gin addiction for maximum profit. They began targeting specific populations with customized marketing approaches that modern observers would recognize as sophisticated psychological warfare. Mother Needham, whose real name was Elizabeth Needham, pioneered techniques for recruiting young women into prostitution by exploiting their gin dependencies. Elizabeth operated several brothels in Covent Garden, but her real skill was identifying vulnerable women and systematically destroying their ability to make independent decisions. Elizabeth's method was brutally effective. She would identify young women who were already drinking heavily but hadn't yet lost their physical attractiveness or social connections. These women were usually domestic servants, shopgirls, or daughters of working-class families who had begun using gin to cope with difficult living conditions. Elizabeth would befriend these women and invite them to social gatherings where gin flowed freely. She would encourage heavy drinking while carefully monitoring each woman's behavior and tolerance. Once she identified women who showed signs of developing serious addiction, Elizabeth would offer them employment in her establishments. The job offers seemed legitimate initially. Elizabeth needed servants, seamstresses, and cooks for her businesses. The work was described as respectable domestic service with good wages and comfortable living arrangements. Women who accepted these positions discovered too late that they had entered a trap designed to exploit their growing gin dependencies. Elizabeth controlled her employees' access to gin completely. Women who worked for her received regular rations of spirits as part of their compensation, but Elizabeth gradually increased these rations while decreasing actual wages. Her employees became increasingly dependent on gin provided by their employer, making it nearly impossible for them to leave even when they realized what was happening to them. Once women were completely addicted and financially dependent, Elizabeth would inform them that their domestic service positions were being eliminated, but that she could offer them more lucrative work entertaining male customers. Women who refused were cut off from gin entirely and thrown out onto the streets with no money, no references, and no way to obtain the alcohol their bodies now required for basic functioning. The transition from domestic service to prostitution was presented as a temporary arrangement just until the women could get back on their feet. But Elizabeth ensured that this transition was permanent by continuing to control her employees' gin supply. Women who tried to leave discovered that gin withdrawal symptoms made it impossible for them to work elsewhere or think clearly enough to develop escape plans. Elizabeth's operation expanded rapidly because gin addiction had created an enormous supply of vulnerable women throughout London. Domestic servants were being dismissed by employers who could no longer tolerate their drinking. Shopgirls were losing jobs because they couldn't function while intoxicated. Young women from respectable families were being disowned by parents who refused to support their gin habits. These displaced women had few options for survival, and Elizabeth Needham provided what seemed like the only available solution. Her brothels offered steady access to gin, protection from street violence, and income that could support serious addiction. For women whose lives had been destroyed by gin, prostitution often seemed like the least terrible available choice. But Elizabeth's influence extended beyond her own establishments. She began training other entrepreneurs in her methods, creating a network of gin exploitation operations throughout London. These businesses shared information about potential targets, coordinated their recruitment efforts, and developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for maintaining control over addicted women. The result was an entire industry built on gin-induced desperation. Hundreds of women were being systematically converted from independent workers into controlled prostitutes through carefully managed addiction. The process was so effective that other criminal organizations began adopting similar approaches for different purposes. Jonathan Wild, London's most notorious criminal mastermind, recognized the potential of Elizabeth's techniques immediately. Wild operated what he called a thief-taking business, where he would arrange for stolen goods to be recovered in exchange for rewards from their original owners. But Wild's real business was controlling London's theft networks through systematic corruption and violence. Wild realized that gin addiction could provide him with more reliable control over criminal employees than traditional methods like intimidation or financial incentives. Addicted criminals needed money constantly and predictably, making them easier to manipulate. They were also more willing to take extreme risks because withdrawal symptoms were more immediately threatening than potential legal consequences. Wild began recruiting gin addicts systematically, but his approach was more sophisticated than Elizabeth Needham's. Instead of creating addiction, Wild targeted people who were already seriously dependent and used their existing desperation to gain control over them. He established a network of gin suppliers who would provide credit to addicted criminals, with Wild guaranteeing repayment through criminal earnings. This system created perfect leverage. Criminals who worked for Wild received steady access to gin, but only as long as they remained productive and obedient. Those who tried to leave Wild's organization found themselves cut off from gin suppliers throughout London, forcing them to return or face potentially fatal withdrawal symptoms. Wild's network grew enormous because gin addiction had created such a large population of potential criminal recruits. Addicted workers who had lost legitimate employment often turned to theft as their only remaining income source. Wild provided these desperate people with training, equipment, and markets for stolen goods, but always within a framework that maintained his absolute control. The sophistication of Wild's operation shocked contemporary observers, who had assumed that criminal organizations were crude and disorganized. Wild maintained detailed records of his employees' activities, coordinated complex multi-person thefts, and even provided what amounted to insurance and retirement benefits for criminals who served him loyally. But Wild's most significant innovation was recognizing that gin addiction could be used to control government officials as effectively as it controlled criminals. Many magistrates, constables, and court clerks had developed serious gin dependencies, making them vulnerable to the same manipulation techniques that worked on thieves and prostitutes. Wild began supplying gin to corrupt officials, gradually increasing their dependencies while carefully documenting their illegal activities. Once officials were completely compromised, Wild could count on them to ignore his criminal operations, provide advance warning of law enforcement activities, and even actively assist in his more ambitious schemes. The result was a criminal organization that had effectively captured significant portions of London's legal system. Wild's network included judges who would dismiss charges against his employees, constables who would arrest his competitors, and court clerks who would lose evidence that threatened his operations. Contemporary observers began to realize that London was experiencing something unprecedented: the emergence of criminal organizations that were more powerful and better organized than legitimate government institutions. These groups controlled entire neighborhoods, influenced legal proceedings, and generated more wealth than many legitimate businesses. The social implications were terrifying. If criminal organizations could provide better security, more reliable services, and steadier employment than legitimate institutions, what incentive did ordinary citizens have to support government authority? Why obey laws when the people enforcing those laws were controlled by criminals? Dr. Thomas Wilson, a physician who worked in some of London's poorest neighborhoods, documented how completely gin had inverted traditional social relationships. Wilson observed families where children supported gin-addicted parents through theft and prostitution. He saw neighborhoods where criminal organizations provided more effective dispute resolution than courts. He treated patients who trusted illegal gin sellers more than licensed physicians. Wilson's medical records from this period reveal a society where normal social bonds had been completely severed. Parents were selling children to support gin habits. Children were abandoning elderly parents who could no longer contribute to family gin purchases. Spouses were murdering each other over access to gin supplies. But Wilson's most disturbing observations concerned community institutions. Churches were closing because congregations couldn't afford both gin and religious donations. Schools were shutting down because gin-addicted parents needed children to work rather than study. Even traditional festivals and community celebrations were disappearing because social gatherings invariably devolved into violent, drunken chaos. The physician began to understand that gin wasn't just creating individual health problems or even family dysfunction. It was systematically destroying the social infrastructure that held communities together. London was becoming a collection of isolated, desperate individuals rather than a functioning urban society. Wilson's attempts to treat gin addiction revealed another disturbing reality. The physical dependency created by constant gin consumption was so severe that many addicts literally could not survive without continued access to alcohol. Withdrawal symptoms included seizures, hallucinations, and cardiac events that frequently proved fatal. This medical reality meant that even people who desperately wanted to escape gin addiction often couldn't do so safely. The physical requirements of withdrawal demanded medical supervision and supportive care that simply weren't available to most addicts. Attempting to quit gin without proper medical support was often a death sentence. Wilson documented dozens of cases where well-intentioned family members or religious counselors tried to help addicts by cutting off their gin supply entirely. The results were almost always tragic. Addicts would suffer severe withdrawal symptoms, become violent or delusional, and frequently die within days of their last drink. These deaths created a vicious cycle that made the gin epidemic even more difficult to address. Families learned that attempting to help addicted relatives was dangerous and potentially fatal. Communities discovered that intervention efforts often made situations worse rather than better. Even medical professionals became reluctant to treat gin addicts because successful treatment required resources and expertise that most practitioners simply didn't possess. The hopelessness was becoming systematic. Individuals couldn't escape gin addiction safely. Families couldn't help addicted members without risking everyone's safety. Communities couldn't address the problem without resources they didn't have. Government couldn't take effective action because political leaders were compromised by their own dependencies or corrupted by industry influence. London was trapped in a social disaster that seemed to have no solution and no end. The gin epidemic had become self-perpetuating, creating conditions that made recovery impossible while generating profits that ensured its continuation. Samuel Johnson, the famous writer and lexicographer, captured this sense of hopelessness in his private journals from this period. Johnson wrote that London had become a great machine for converting human beings into beasts, and that gin had accomplished what foreign enemies and natural disasters had never achieved: the systematic destruction of English civilization from within. Johnson's observations were particularly valuable because he had access to all levels of London society. He socialised with wealthy merchants and government officials, but he also spent time in taverns and gin shops, frequented by working-class residents. His journals provide a comprehensive picture of how gin addiction affected every social class and neighbourhood. According to Johnson, wealthy gin addicts were often more dangerous than poor ones because they had resources to support more extreme habits and influence to avoid legal consequences. He described upper-class parties where guests consumed gin until they lost consciousness, and business meetings where important decisions were made by men too intoxicated to understand what they were agreeing to. But Johnson also observed that wealth provided no real protection against gin's destructive effects. Rich addicts lost fortunes just as quickly as poor ones lost their few possessions. Wealthy families disintegrated under the pressure of addiction just as completely as working-class households. Social status meant nothing when gin dependency reached its final stages. The universality of gin's impact across all social classes meant that London lacked any stable, unaffected population that could provide leadership or resources for addressing the crisis. Unlike other social problems that primarily affected specific groups, gin addiction was destroying the entire social hierarchy simultaneously. This comprehensive social breakdown created opportunities for the most ruthless and adaptable criminals to accumulate unprecedented power and wealth. The traditional barriers that had limited criminal activity, such as community surveillance, family obligations, and respect for authority, had been systematically eliminated by gin-induced social chaos. The most terrifying aspect of this collapse wasn't the violence or the poverty, or even the mass addiction itself. It was how quickly London's residents began to accept their new reality as normal. Children who had never known sober parents assumed that constant intoxication was simply how adults behaved. Young people entering the workforce expected their employers to be drunk most of the time. Even the clergy began incorporating gin consumption into religious ceremonies, reasoning that if they couldn't eliminate the substance from their congregations' lives, they might as well sanctify it. This normalization of chaos created a generation that had no memory of functional society and no expectation that things could be different. When occasional visitors from rural areas or foreign countries expressed shock at London's condition, residents would look at them with genuine confusion. This was simply how cities worked, wasn't it? This was what urban life had always been like, right? Mary Toft represents this disturbing adaptation to dysfunction. Mary worked as a seamstress in Southwark, one of London's most gin-saturated neighbourhoods, and she had developed what she considered a perfectly reasonable business model for surviving in this new world. Mary realised that gin-addicted customers would pay premium prices for clothing that incorporated hidden pockets, specifically designed for concealing gin bottles. Her innovation wasn't just practical, it was cultural. Mary was designing clothes for a society where everyone needed to carry alcohol constantly, but couldn't admit to doing so publicly. Her garments featured secret compartments in sleeves, hollow buttons that could hold small amounts of gin, and fabric patterns that camouflaged stains from spilled liquor. Mary's customers included respectable merchants, government clerks, and even some members of the clergy. These people couldn't afford to appear intoxicated in public, but they also couldn't function without constant access to alcohol. Mary's clothing allowed them to maintain the pretense of sobriety while feeding their addictions throughout the day. The success of Mary's business revealed how completely gin had infiltrated every aspect of London society. People weren't just drinking at home or in taverns anymore. They were consuming alcohol during business meetings, religious services, court proceedings, and family gatherings. The entire social fabric had been rewoven around the assumption that everyone was always at least slightly intoxicated. But Mary's story takes a darker turn that illustrates how this normalization of dysfunction created new forms of exploitation. Mary began to understand that her customers' desperate need for concealed alcohol made them vulnerable to blackmail. She started documenting who was buying her specially designed clothing and began demanding additional payments in exchange for discretion, Mary's blackmail operation grew sophisticated quickly. She would approach customers who held respectable positions and inform them that she possessed evidence of their gin dependency. For a monthly fee, Mary would continue providing her specialized clothing and would remain silent about her customers' addictions. Those who refused to pay found themselves exposed publicly, often losing their jobs and social standing. The brilliance of Mary's scheme was that it exploited the gap between public expectations and private reality. London society still officially condemned excessive drinking, but privately everyone was addicted to gin. This hypocrisy created perfect conditions for blackmail, because exposure meant social destruction, while continued secrecy simply required ongoing payments. Mary's success attracted imitators throughout London. Blackmail became a growth industry as entrepreneurs realized that nearly everyone in the city was hiding gin-related secrets that could be monetized. Servants blackmailed employers, employees blackmailed supervisors, and even children blackmailed their own parents using evidence of family drinking habits. The proliferation of gin-related blackmail created a parallel economy where information about addiction became as valuable as the alcohol itself. Networks of informants developed to track and document people's drinking patterns. Professional blackmailers emerged who specialized in gathering evidence and managing ongoing extortion operations. This information economy accelerated social breakdown by destroying trust between individuals and institutions. People became afraid to seek help for their addictions because asking for assistance meant admitting to problems that could be used against them later. Families stopped confiding in each other because family members might become sources of blackmail material. The isolation created by this mutual suspicion made the gin epidemic even more difficult to address. Communities couldn't organize effective responses to addiction problems when community members were constantly gathering evidence to use against each other. Government officials couldn't develop coherent policies when they were being blackmailed by the very people they were supposed to be helping. Robert Walpole, Britain's first Prime Minister, embodied these contradictions perfectly. Walpole publicly supported efforts to control gin consumption and frequently gave speeches about the moral dangers of excessive drinking. But privately, Walpole was being blackmailed by several different criminal organisations that possessed evidence of his own serious gin dependency. Walpole's situation was particularly complex because his political enemies were also being blackmailed by many of the same criminal groups. This created a strange form of political stability where major policy decisions were being influenced by criminals who had compromising information about leaders from all political factions. The Prime Minister's private correspondence reveals a man trapped in an impossible situation. Walpole knew that strong action against the gin trade was necessary for Britain's survival, but he also knew that taking such action would result in the release of information that would destroy his political career and personal reputation. Walpole's paralysis had national consequences that extended far beyond London. Other British cities were beginning to experience their own gin epidemics as the London model spread throughout the country. Bristol, Liverpool, and Manchester were all seeing rapid increases in gin consumption and related social problems. But these other cities looked to London for leadership and guidance about how to address their emerging problems. When the capital city proved incapable of controlling its own gin epidemic, regional authorities concluded that the situation was hopeless and largely abandoned efforts to prevent similar disasters in their own communities. The spread of gin-related dysfunction from London to other British cities created a national crisis that threatened the entire kingdom's stability. Military recruitment became difficult because potential soldiers were often too damaged by alcohol to serve effectively. Tax collection suffered as gin-related crime, and social breakdown made entire districts ungovernable. International observers began to question Britain's ability to maintain its position as a major European power. French and Spanish diplomats sent reports to their governments describing a nation that was literally drinking itself to death. Some foreign leaders began making plans based on the assumption that Britain would soon collapse from internal dysfunction. These international concerns weren't entirely unfounded. British naval efficiency had declined significantly as gin addiction spread among sailors and port workers. Trade relationships suffered when British merchants proved unreliable due to their drinking habits. Even diplomatic negotiations became difficult when British representatives frequently appeared intoxicated at important meetings. The economic implications were staggering on a national scale. Productivity declined across all industries as gin addiction made workers unreliable and unsafe. Innovation slowed as the most creative minds were destroyed by alcohol dependency. Investment in long-term projects decreased because investors couldn't count on stable social conditions. Peter the Wild Boy, a feral child who had been discovered in German forests and brought to London as a curiosity for the royal court, provided an unexpected perspective on the city's transformation. Peter had no previous experience with human civilization, so he observed London society without the assumptions that prevented residents from recognizing how abnormal their situation had become. Court records describe Peter's reactions to London street life with fascinating detail. Peter showed no fear of obvious dangers like violent criminals or collapsed buildings, but he became terrified when he witnessed ordinary social interactions between gin-addicted Londoners. The constant aggression, unpredictable behaviour, and emotional instability that residents had learned to accept as normal struck Peter as evidence that these humans were fundamentally different from the creatures he had expected to encounter. Peter's responses suggested that gin addiction had altered London residents' behaviour so dramatically that they no longer seemed fully human to an outside observer. The Wild Boy, who had been raised by animals in the forest, found London society more disturbing and incomprehensible than life among wolves. These observations from someone completely outside normal social expectations highlighted how thoroughly gin had transformed basic human relationships in London. Behaviours that residents had gradually adapted to accept were actually so extreme that they shocked someone who had never experienced human civilization at all. Dr. Richard Mead, the royal physician, used Peter's reactions as evidence in his reports to King George about the gin epidemic's severity. Mead argued that if a feral child found London society more disturbing than life in the wilderness, then the city's social problems had progressed beyond anything in human experience. But even Dr. Mead's prestigious position and royal access couldn't generate effective government. King George himself was rumoured to consume gin regularly, though palace officials denied these reports. The monarch's possible addiction meant that even the highest levels of government might be compromised by the same problems affecting ordinary citizens. The royal court's dysfunction became increasingly obvious to foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries. Diplomatic receptions featured open gin consumption by high-ranking officials. Important state business was conducted by ministers who were visibly intoxicated. Even royal ceremonies became chaotic events where protocol collapsed under the influence of widespread drinking. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, a prominent aristocrat and writer, documented the court's deterioration in letters to friends throughout Europe. Lady Mary described scenes that would have been unimaginable just a few decades earlier. Cabinet ministers passing out during important meetings, courtiers engaging in drunken brawls at state dinners, and even members of the royal family appearing publicly in states of obvious intoxication. Lady Mary's correspondence reveals how gin addiction had penetrated the highest levels of British society without regard for rank, education, or social responsibility. The epidemic wasn't just affecting London's poorest neighbourhoods anymore. It was systematically destroying the nation's entire leadership class. The aristocracy's addiction created particularly dangerous problems, because wealthy addicts could afford much larger quantities of gin and much more elaborate methods of consumption. Some nobles were drinking amounts that would have killed ordinary people, sustaining their habits through access to the purest and strongest spirits available. Lord Hervey, a prominent courtier and political figure, exemplified this upper-class excess. Hervey maintained private distilleries on his estates and employed teams of servants whose only job was managing his alcohol supply. his consumption reached levels that modern medical professionals would consider impossible to survive. But Hervey's addiction went beyond personal excess. He began using gin as a political tool, hosting elaborate drinking parties where important government decisions were made by heavily intoxicated officials. These gatherings became informal centers of power, where national policy was determined by people too drunk to understand the consequences of their choices. Hervey's influence grew because other addicted officials found his parties irresistible. The promise of unlimited high-quality gin attracted politicians, judges, and military officers who might otherwise have avoided his political faction. Hervey essentially bought political loyalty with superior alcohol. The corruption of decision-making processes at the highest levels of government had consequences that rippled throughout British society. Laws were passed without proper consideration of their effects. Military campaigns were planned by commanders who were too intoxicated to assess strategic realities accurately. Economic policies were implemented by officials who couldn't understand their own proposals. This governmental dysfunction created opportunities for foreign powers to manipulate British policy through carefully planned interventions. French agents began supplying premium gin to key British officials, gaining influence over important decisions through managed addiction rather than traditional espionage or bribery. The French strategy was brilliantly subtle. Instead of trying to recruit British officials as conscious collaborators, French agents simply ensured that those officials remained too intoxicated to make decisions that might threaten French interests. The approach was nearly undetectable because it exploited existing addictions rather than creating new forms of corruption. Spanish intelligence services adopted similar approaches, using gin supplies to influence British naval planning and colonial administration. Even smaller European powers began trying to manipulate British policy through alcohol-based influence operations. These foreign interventions succeeded because gin addiction had made British officials completely predictable in their behaviour. Would consistently addicted ministers choose options that protected their access to alcohol over alternatives that might serve national interests? Foreign agents could reliably influence British policy by controlling gin supplies to key decision-makers. The national security implications were terrifying. Britain was losing control over its own government to foreign powers that understood how to exploit the gin epidemic strategically. The nation that had once been Europe's most formidable military and economic force was being systematically weakened through managed addiction of its leadership class. Military effectiveness declined dramatically as gin addiction spread through the officer corps. Battle planning became unreliable when commanding officers were intoxicated during strategic discussions. Troop discipline collapsed when soldiers observed their leaders drinking heavily while demanding sobriety from enlisted men. Admiral Edward Vernon, one of the few senior military officers who remained relatively unaffected by gin addiction, documented the Navy's deterioration in reports that he sent directly to sympathetic members of Parliament. Vernon described ships where entire crews were too intoxicated to perform basic sailing duties, ports where administrative chaos made supply operations impossible, and naval battles where British vessels performed poorly because their officers were drunk during combat. Vernon's reports provided detailed evidence that gin addiction was threatening Britain's ability to defend itself militarily. But even these urgent warnings failed to generate effective government response because the officials who received them were often too intoxicated to understand their significance or too compromised by their own addictions to take action. The Admiral's frustration grew as he realized that traditional military discipline was completely ineffective against gin addiction. Courts-martial and punishment details had no impact on officers whose physical dependency on alcohol was stronger than their fear of professional consequences. Even execution threats failed to deter behavior driven by chemical addiction rather than conscious choice. Vernon began experimenting with alternative approaches to maintaining naval effectiveness despite widespread addiction among his personnel. He developed systems for rotating duties so that essential operations could continue even when key officers were incapacitated by drinking. He established backup command structures that could function when primary commanders were too intoxicated to make decisions. But Vernon's adaptations, while temporarily effective, represented a fundamental abandonment of professional military standards. The Royal Navy was learning to function despite systematic intoxication of its personnel, rather than addressing the underlying problem of gin addiction. This acceptance of diminished capability had long-term consequences for Britain's international position. Other European powers began to perceive British military weakness and started making territorial and economic demands that they would never have attempted when Britain's forces were fully effective. The War of Jenkins's Ear, which began in 1739, revealed the full extent of gin's impact on British military capability. British forces performed poorly in multiple theatres, suffering defeats that shocked contemporary observers who remembered Britain's previous military dominance. Captain Robert Jenkins himself, whose severed ear had provided the war's name and initial justification, was reportedly a heavy gin drinker whose account of his mistreatment by Spanish forces may have been distorted by alcohol-induced paranoia and confusion. The incident that triggered a major international conflict might have been largely the product of gin-addled imagination, rather than actual Spanish aggression. Military historians later concluded that many of the war's strategic disasters resulted directly from gin-impaired decision-making by British commanders. The Siege of Cartagena, one of the war's most significant British defeats, failed largely because Admiral Vernon and General Thomas Wentworth spent crucial planning sessions in states of serious intoxication. The war's poor outcomes further damaged British international prestige and encouraged other European powers to view Britain as a declining force. Spain, France, and other rivals began making increasingly aggressive moves against British interests, calculating that gin addiction had permanently weakened their primary competitor. These international challenges created additional pressure for domestic reform, but they also made reform more difficult by diverting resources and attention away from addressing the gin epidemic. Britain found itself trapped in a vicious cycle where gin-related problems created international vulnerabilities that made it harder to address gin-related problems. The situation seemed hopeless. Individual attempts at reform failed because they couldn't address the epidemic's systematic nature. Community-level interventions collapsed because communities lacked the resources and stability necessary for sustained effort. Government action remained paralyzed by political corruption and official addiction. Even religious institutions, traditionally society's moral backbone, had been compromised by gin addiction among clergy and congregation members alike. Churches that should have provided leadership and inspiration for reform efforts were instead contributing to the problem through their own drinking and their acceptance of gin-related donations from distillers and sellers. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself was rumoured to maintain extensive wine and gin cellars, though church officials denied these reports. Whether true or not, the rumours reflected widespread understanding that even the highest religious authorities were not immune to the epidemic's effects. Parish churches throughout London reported declining attendance as gin shops provided more attractive gathering places for community members. Sunday services competed unsuccessfully with establishments that offered immediate gratification rather than promises of future salvation. Some clergy attempted to incorporate gin consumption into religious practices, reasoning that they could better serve their congregations by meeting people where they were, rather than demanding impossible standards of sobriety. These experiments typically resulted in chants became enotic services, where religious observed distinguishable from tavern behaviour. The collapse of religious authority removed one of society's most important sources of moral guidance and community organisation. Without functional churches to provide alternative social structures, gin-centred institutions became the primary organising forces in many neighbourhoods. This religious vacuum created opportunities for criminal organisations to position themselves as sources of stability and moral authority. Some criminal leaders began adopting religious rhetoric and ceremonies, presenting their organisations as legitimate alternatives to failed traditional institutions. Mother Clap, whose real name was Margaret Clap, exemplified this phenomenon. Margaret operated several gin houses in Holborn, but she also functioned as an informal community leader who provided services that churches and government agencies could no longer deliver effectively. Margaret's establishments served as unofficial community centres where residents could gather for social interaction, business networking, and mutual support. She mediated disputes between neighbours, organised collective responses to external threats, and even conducted informal marriage and funeral ceremonies for people who couldn't afford or access traditional religious services. But Margaret's community leadership came with a price. She expected absolute loyalty from residents who benefited from her services, and she used her position to control neighbourhood, economic and social activity. People who challenged her authority found themselves excluded from essential services and social networks. Margaret's success attracted attention from other criminal entrepreneurs who began establishing similar operations throughout London. These criminal community centres provided genuine services that people desperately needed, but they also extended criminal control over previously independent neighbourhoods. The phenomenon represented a fundamental shift in London's social organisation. Traditional institutions like churches, guilds, and local government had been replaced by criminal organisations that provided similar services but operated according to very different principles and priorities. This transformation accelerated as more neighbourhoods discovered that criminal organisations could deliver better results than legitimate institutions. Why rely on corrupt constables when criminal organisations provided more effective security? Why attend dysfunctional churches when gin houses offered better community fellowship? The choice wasn't really between good and evil anymore. It was between functional criminal institutions and dysfunctional legitimate ones. For desperate residents trying to survive in gin-soaked London, the moral considerations were less important than practical effectiveness. Thomas Brown, a blacksmith who lived in Clerkenwell, embodied this pragmatic adaptation to social chaos. Thomas had initially tried to maintain traditional standards of behaviour and community involvement, but he gradually realised that these approaches were counterproductive in the new environment. Thomas's blacksmith shop had been robbed repeatedly by addicted criminals, but legitimate law enforcement provided no effective protection. When Thomas began paying protection money to local criminal organisations, the robberies stopped immediately. The criminal organisations proved more reliable and responsive than official authorities. Thomas's business relationships also shifted toward criminal networks because legitimate customers increasingly proved unreliable due to their gin addictions. Criminal organisations, despite their illegal activities, actually provided more stable and predictable business partnerships than many supposedly respectable merchants. The blacksmith's social life followed the same pattern. Traditional community organisations had collapsed due to gin-related dysfunction, but criminal-controlled establishments provided opportunities for meaningful social interaction and mutual support. Thomas never considered himself a criminal, and he continued to view his situation as temporary adaptation to extraordinary circumstances. But his choices reflected broader patterns that were transforming London's entire social structure. Thousands of residents were making similar decisions every day, choosing functional criminal alternatives over dysfunctional legitimate institutions. These individual choices, repeated throughout the city, were gradually replacing London's traditional social organisation with criminal-controlled systems. The transformation was so gradual and seemed so reasonable from individual perspectives that many people didn't recognise how completely their society had been restructured. They were still living in London, still going about their daily business, still maintaining family relationships and community connections. But the London they were living in was fundamentally different from the city that had existed just a few decades earlier. Criminal organisations had become the dominant social institutions. Addiction had become the primary organising principle of community life, and violence had become the normal method for resolving disputes. The old London hadn't been destroyed through military conquest or natural disaster. It had been systematically replaced through millions of individual decisions made by people who were just trying to survive in increasingly impossible circumstances. By 1740, this transformation was essentially complete in many neighbourhoods. Criminal organisations controlled most economic activity, provided most social services, and exercised more effective authority than legitimate government institutions. The jinn epidemic had accomplished what foreign armies and domestic rebellions had never achieved. It had completely restructured British society according to principles that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. London had become something unprecedented in human history. A major city where criminal organizations functioned as the primary government, where addiction served as the foundation of economic activity, and where violence provided the basic framework for social interaction. The most terrifying aspect of this transformation was how normal it had begun to seem to the people living through it. The children born into this world knew no other reality. Little William Hartwell, born in 1738 to a family in Spitalfields, learned to walk by navigating around unconscious bodies littering his tenement floor. His first words weren't mama or papa, but gin and more, phrases he heard constantly from the adults around him. William's childhood was spent running errands between gin shops, carrying messages for criminal organizations, and learning to identify which adults were safe to approach based on their level of intoxication. William's education came not from schools, which had largely ceased functioning in his neighborhood, but from the streets themselves. He learned arithmetic by calculating gin prices and making change for customers too drunk to handle money accurately. He developed reading skills by studying the crude signs hanging outside illegal distilleries. His geography lessons involved memorizing the locations of gin shops, safe houses, and territories controlled by different criminal gangs. By age 8, William was essentially supporting his family through various illegal activities. He served as a lookout for underground distilleries, warning operators when government inspectors approached. He delivered gin to customers who couldn't risk being seen entering shops publicly. He even learned to identify the specific preferences of regular customers, knowing exactly which type of adulterated gin each person preferred and how much they typically consumed. William's story wasn't unique. Thousands of children throughout London were growing up with similar experiences, developing skills and perspectives that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. These children formed their own informal networks, sharing information about opportunities for earning money, warning each other about dangerous situations, and providing mutual support that adults in their lives were too impaired to offer. But the most disturbing aspect of this child culture was how sophisticated it had become in exploiting adult addiction. Children like William understood gin dependency better than most medical professionals of the era. They could predict adult behavior with frightening accuracy, manipulate addicted adults to their advantage, and even create situations that increased addiction severity when it served their purposes. Sarah Whitmore discovered the darker implications of this phenomenon when she tried to help her neighbor's children. Sarah was one of the few adults in her Bethnal Green neighborhood who had managed to avoid serious gin addiction, though she consumed the substance daily like everyone around her. She maintained enough sobriety to recognize that the children in her area were being damaged by their circumstances. Sarah attempted to organize informal schooling for neighborhood children, offering to teach basic reading and writing skills in her home. The response shocked her. Children attended these sessions not to learn, but to study Sarah herself. They wanted to understand why she drank less than other adults, how she managed to maintain her home and appearance, and what weaknesses they might exploit. Within the Children Hay weeks, Sarah discovered been systematically stealing from her during these educational sessions. They had learned her daily routines and identified opportunities to take small amounts of money, food, and gin without being detected. But their theft wasn't random or desperate. It was calculated and strategic, designed to gradually increase Sarah's financial pressure until she would be forced to rely on criminal organizations for support. The children had essentially organized a long-term operation to convert Sarah from an independent adult into another addicted customer for their criminal employers. They understood that adults who maintained some level of independence represented missed opportunities for the criminal organizations they served. Sarah's experience revealed how completely the social order had been inverted in gin-soaked London. Children weren't being protected and educated by adults. Instead, children were systematically exploiting and corrupting adults to serve criminal enterprises that had replaced traditional family and community structures. Dr. James Kirkpatrick, a physician who attempted to document these changes in child behaviour, concluded that London was witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of human development. Children were acquiring adult-level skills in manipulation, violence, and criminal enterprise, while never developing basic capabilities like literacy, emotional regulation, or moral reasoning. Kirkpatrick's observations suggested that gin addiction wasn't just damaging individual children, it was creating a generation that would be fundamentally incapable of participating in normal society, even if the epidemic somehow ended. These children had learned to survive in chaos, but they lacked the skills necessary for functioning in peaceful, orderly communities. The physician's attempts to treat child victims of the epidemic revealed additional disturbing patterns. Children who had grown up around constant gin consumption showed physical and mental development problems that persisted even when they were removed from addicted environments. Their brains had been shaped by exposure to alcohol and violence during crucial developmental periods. But perhaps most troubling were the children who seemed perfectly healthy and intelligent, but had developed value systems completely incompatible with traditional moral standards. These children could function effectively in criminal environments while showing no capacity for empathy, honesty, or cooperation with legitimate authority. Margaret Finch represented this new type of child perfectly. Margaret was 12 years old in 1741. Physically healthy, obviously intelligent, and completely immoral by traditional standards. She had been raised in gin houses and criminal organizations from infancy, never experiencing normal family relationships or community structures. Margaret's skills were impressive by any measure. She could read and write better than most adults in her neighborhood. She spoke multiple languages learned from the diverse criminal networks operating in London. She understood complex financial transactions and could negotiate sophisticated business arrangements. But Margaret used these abilities exclusively for criminal purposes. She organized gangs of children who younger specialized in robbing gin-addicted adults. She developed elaborate confidence schemes that targeted wealthy visitors to London's criminal districts. She even established her own small-scale gin distribution operation that competed successfully with adult-run businesses. Margaret's success attracted attention from established criminal leaders who recognized her potential value. Several organizations attempted to recruit her, offering positions that would have provided wealth and security. But Margaret consistently refused these offers, preferring to maintain her independence and continue expanding her own criminal enterprises. Her decision reflected a new form of ambition that previous generations would have found incomprehensible. Margaret wasn't interested in joining existing organizations or working within established systems. She wanted to create her own criminal empire that would eventually dominate the organizations currently trying to recruit her. Margaret's confidence wasn't based on childish fantasy. She understood London's criminal landscape better than many adult participants, and she had identified weaknesses in existing organizations that could be exploited by someone with her particular combination of skills and ruthlessness. The emergence of children like Margaret represented a fundamental shift in criminal organization that had implications extending far beyond individual cases. These children possessed capabilities that adult criminals lacked, but they also had ambitions and perspectives that threatened existing power structures. Traditional criminal organizations had been built around adult relationships and adult motivations, but the children emerging from gin-soaked London operated according to different principles and pursued different goals. They represented a new form of criminal enterprise that was potentially more dangerous than anything that had existed before. Henry Fielding, the magistrate and writer who would later become famous for his novels, encountered this new generation of criminals regularly in his judicial work. Fielding's court records from this period document cases that challenged every assumption about crime, punishment, and human nature that had guided for centuries. Fielding described legal-thinking child criminals who showed no emotional response to punishment or threats of punishment. These children understood consequences perfectly, but had developed decision-making processes that prioritized immediate advantage over long-term considerations. Traditional legal deterrence simply had no effect on minds shaped by constant exposure to chaos and violence. The magistrate's most disturbing cases involved children who had committed serious crimes but genuinely couldn't understand why their actions were considered wrong. They had grown up in environments where violence, theft, and deception were normal survival strategies. The moral framework that made traditional law enforcement possible simply didn't exist in their mental landscape. Fielding began experimenting with alternative approaches to dealing with these child criminals. But every strategy he attempted failed in unexpected ways. Educational programs were sabotaged by children who used them as opportunities to corrupt instructors. Religious instruction was ignored or perverted into justifications for criminal behavior. Even simple kindness was interpreted as weakness to be exploited. The magistrate gradually realized that he was encountering something unprecedented in legal history. These weren't normal children who had made bad choices. They were products of social conditions so extreme that they had created fundamentally different types of human beings. Fielding's reports to higher authorities described his growing conviction that traditional legal and social institutions were completely inadequate for addressing the problems created by gin-induced social breakdown. The children appearing in his court represented challenges that existing systems had never been designed to handle. But even more disturbing were Fielding's observations about how these children were influencing adult behavior. Criminal organizations that employed child operatives began adopting the children's methods and perspectives. Adult criminals started emulating the ruthless pragmatism and moral flexibility that characterized the new generation. The result was a form of criminal evolution, where adult organizations became more dangerous and effective by learning from children who had grown up in criminal environments. Traditional criminal enterprises that failed to adapt were systematically eliminated by hybrid organizations that combined adult resources with child-derived strategies. Captain Thomas Coram, still operating his foundling hospital despite mounting challenges, documented this criminal evolution from a different perspective. Coram's facility had become a laboratory for studying how gin addiction affected child development, but it had also become a target for criminal organizations seeking to recruit or corrupt the children under his care. Coram discovered that criminal organizations were systematically attempting to infiltrate his institution through various methods. Some sent adult agents posing as potential adoptive parents. Others tried to corrupt staff members through bribery or threats. The most sophisticated operations involved placing criminal children among legitimate foundlings to serve as inside agents. These infiltration attempts revealed the strategic sophistication that criminal organizations had developed. They understood that controlling child development was crucial for maintaining long-term power, and they were willing to invest significant resources in preventing alternative institutions from offering children different paths. Coram's defensive measures against these infiltration attempts inadvertently provided insights into how criminal organizations operated internally. His security precautions revealed communication networks, command structures, and resource allocation systems that rivaled those of legitimate government institutions. The foundling hospital's experiences suggested that criminal organizations had evolved beyond simple profit-seeking enterprises. They had become alternative social systems that were actively competing with legitimate institutions for control over population and territory. This competition wasn't just economic or political. It was fundamentally cultural, involving different visions of how human communities should be organized and what values should guide social relationships. Criminal organizations offered immediate material benefits and clear power structures, while legitimate institutions promised distant rewards and demanded adherence to increasingly irrelevant moral standards. For children and adults living in djinn-saturated London, the choice between these alternatives was becoming increasingly obvious. Criminal organisations provided security, opportunity, and community in a world where legitimate institutions offered mainly chaos, disappointment, and abandonment. Elizabeth Canning's story illustrates how this choice played out for individual young people trying to navigate London's transformed social landscape. Elizabeth was 16 years old in 1741, the daughter of a carpenter who had managed to avoid serious gin addiction, but had been economically marginalised by the criminal organisations that controlled his neighbourhood's construction industry. Elizabeth worked as a domestic servant for middle-class families who were struggling to maintain respectability despite their own gin dependencies. Her position provided her with unique insights into how addiction affected different social classes and how criminal organisations were penetrating even supposedly respectable households. Elizabeth observed that wealthy gin addicts were often more vulnerable to criminal exploitation than poor ones, because they had more to lose and were more desperate to maintain appearances. She watched domestic servants systematically rob addicted employers, who were too impaired to notice missing valuables or money. But Elizabeth also saw opportunities for someone with her particular combination of skills and social position. She understood both legitimate society and criminal networks well enough to serve as an intermediary between them. She could help respectable families access criminal services discreetly while providing criminal organisations with intelligence about wealthy targets. Elizabeth's decision to pursue these opportunities wasn't driven by moral corruption or desperate poverty. She simply recognised that traditional paths to social advancement had been eliminated by gin-induced social breakdown. Criminal organisations offered the only realistic possibilities for improving her circumstances. Her initial involvement with criminal networks was limited and carefully calculated. Elizabeth provided information about her employers' habits and vulnerabilities in exchange for protection and modest financial compensation. She helped coordinate discreet criminal services like debt collection and dispute resolution for families who couldn't rely on legitimate institutions. But Elizabeth's role expanded rapidly as criminal organisations recognised her value. She began managing complex operations that required someone who could interact convincingly with both criminal and legitimate populations. Her respectable appearance and social skills made her perfect for confidence schemes targeting wealthy addicts. Elizabeth's success in these roles provided her with income, security, and social status that would have been impossible through legitimate employment. She was earning more money at 16 than most adult women could expect to make through traditional work, and she was gaining practical skills and social connections that offered long-term career prospects. But Elizabeth's story took an unexpected turn that reveals how completely gin addiction had distorted London's social dynamics. In January 1753, Elizabeth disappeared for nearly a month, later claiming that she had been kidnapped and held captive by a group of criminals led by an old woman named Mother Wells. Elizabeth's account of her captivity became a sensation that divided London society along unexpected lines. Some people believed her story and demanded harsh punishment for her alleged captors. Others suspected that Elizabeth had fabricated the entire incident, possibly to cover up her own criminal activities or to generate sympathy and financial support. The controversy revealed how gin addiction had undermined basic social trust and rational discourse. People's opinions about Elizabeth's case were influenced more by their own criminal associations and addiction levels than by evidence or logical analysis. Addicted individuals tended to believe stories that justified their own paranoia and victimization narratives, while criminal organizations supported interpretations that served their strategic interests. The legal proceedings surrounding Elizabeth's case demonstrated how thoroughly the justice system had been compromised by gin-related dysfunction. Witnesses gave contradictory testimony that reflected their various criminal affiliations rather than factual observations. Judges made decisions based on political considerations rather than legal evidence. Even the jury selection process was manipulated by criminal organizations seeking favorable outcomes. The case ultimately became less about determining what had actually happened to Elizabeth Canning than about which version of events would best serve the various criminal and political interests involved. Truth became secondary to strategic advantage in a legal system that had been thoroughly corrupted by gin-induced social breakdown. But Elizabeth's story, whether true or fabricated, captured something essential about life in gin-soaked London. Young people were constantly vulnerable to violence and exploitation, but they were also capable of sophisticated deception and manipulation. The line between victim and perpetrator had become so blurred that individual cases were impossible to evaluate using traditional moral or legal frameworks. John Hill, a botanist and writer who observed London society during this period, concluded that gin addiction had created a form of social chaos that was unprecedented in human history. Hill's scientific background provided him with analytical tools that most contemporary observers lacked, allowing him to identify patterns and trends that others missed. Hill's botanical work had taught him to study complex systems by examining how individual components interacted with each other and with their environment. He applied similar analytical methods to understanding how gin addiction was transforming London's social ecosystem. Hill's observations revealed that gin addiction functioned like an invasive species that systematically displaced existing social relationships and institutions. Just as plants as invas could transform entire landscapes by outcompeting native species, gin addiction was restructuring human communities by making traditional social bonds impossible to maintain. The botanist identified specific mechanisms through which this transformation occurred. Gin addiction created economic incentives that favored short-term exploitation over long-term cooperation. It generated psychological changes that made individuals incapable of fulfilling traditional social roles. It established power dynamics that rewarded ruthlessness while punishing traditional virtues like honesty and loyalty. Hill's analysis suggested that gin addiction wasn't just causing social problems. It was systematically selecting for personality types and behavioral patterns that were incompatible with civilized society. London was experiencing a form of social evolution, where the most ruthless and amoral individuals gained advantages that allowed them to dominate increasingly larger portions of the population. This evolutionary pressure was creating new forms of human organization that combined the worst aspects of both civilization and barbarism. Criminal organizations possessed sophisticated technologies and organizational structures, but they operated according to principles that were fundamentally predatory and destructive. Hill predicted that this process would continue until either gin addiction was eliminated or London's entire population had been transformed into something that could no longer be considered civilized. He saw no possibility for stable coexistence between gin-addicted criminal communities and traditional social institutions. The botanist's predictions proved remarkably accurate. By 1742, vast areas of London had become essentially ungovernable by legitimate authorities. Criminal organizations controlled territory, collected taxes, administered justice, and provided services that traditional government institutions could no longer deliver effectively. These criminal territories weren't chaotic wastelands, despite their lawless nature. They were highly organized communities with complex rules, hierarchies, and cultural practices. But their organization served predatory purposes that made them fundamentally hostile to neighboring communities that still attempted to maintain traditional standards. The result was a form of urban warfare where different social systems competed for territory and resources through constant low-level violence. Traditional communities found themselves under siege by criminal organizations that possessed superior organization, motivation, and resources. Mary Jones experienced this siege mentality firsthand in her attempts to maintain a legitimate business in increasingly criminalized London. Mary operated a bakery in Whitechapel that had been in her family for 3 generations, serving customers who valued quality bread and honest dealing over the immediate gratification offered by criminal enterprises. But Mary's business model became increasingly difficult to sustain as gin addiction transformed her customer base and operating environment. Regular customers became unreliable as their addiction progressed, often unable to pay for purchases or becoming violent when refused credit. Suppliers demanded higher prices and more frequent payments because gin-related crime made business relationships unpredictable and dangerous. Mary's most serious challenges came from criminal organizations that viewed legitimate businesses as obstacles to their territorial control. These groups demanded protection payments, imposed their own taxation systems, and required Mary to provide services that supported their criminal activities. When Mary initially refused these demands, criminal organizations began systematic campaigns to destroy her business. They sent addicted customers to create disturbances that drove away legitimate patrons. They contaminated her supplies and equipment, making it impossible to produce quality products. They spread rumors about her business practices that damaged her reputation in the community. But the most effective pressure came from Mary's own family members and employees who had developed gin dependencies. These people, whom Mary had trusted and supported for years, began stealing from the business, selling information to criminal competitors, and sabotaging operations from within. Mary gradually realized that maintaining a legitimate business required constant warfare against criminal organizations, addicted customers, corrupted suppliers, and compromised employees. The energy and resources needed for this struggle left little opportunity for actually producing and selling bread. Her experience was replicated throughout London as legitimate businesses discovered that criminal organizations could destroy them through systematic pressure that traditional legal and economic institutions were powerless to resist. The competitive advantages that had historically favored honest enterprises had been eliminated by gin-induced social breakdown. Mary's eventual decision to sell her business to a criminal organization represented the broader pattern of legitimate economic activity being absorbed into criminal networks. Her bakery continued operating, but it now served primarily as a front for illegal activities, while providing bread as a secondary function. The transformation of Mary's business illustrated how criminal organizations were creating parallel economic systems that offered many of the same services as legitimate enterprises, but operated according to fundamentally different principles. These parallel systems were often more efficient and reliable than their legitimate counterparts because they could use violence and coercion to solve problems that legal businesses had to address through slower and more expensive methods. Samuel Richardson, the printer and novelist who would later write Pamela and Clarissa, documented this economic transformation from the perspective of someone whose business required extensive interaction with various levels of London society. Richardson's printing shop produced materials for legitimate businesses, government agencies, and criminal organizations, providing him with unique insights into how different economic systems operated. Richardson observed that criminal organizations often demonstrated superior business practices compared to legitimate enterprises. They paid bills promptly, maintained clear contractual relationships, and provided reliable security for business operations. Their illegal status didn't prevent them from operating more professionally than many supposedly respectable businesses. The printer's most successful clients during this period were criminal organizations that needed sophisticated printing services for counterfeiting, document forgery, and propaganda operations. These premium prices, clients pay never disputed charges and provided steady per despite the economic work that allowed Richardson's business to prose chaos affecting other legitimate enterprises. But Richardson also recognized that his business success was making him complicit in criminal activities that were destroying London society. His printing services enabled counterfeiting operations that undermined legitimate currency. His document forgery supported identity theft and fraud schemes that victimized honest citizens. His propaganda materials helped criminal organizations recruit new members and expand their territorial control. Richardson's moral dilemma reflected the broader challenge facing anyone trying to maintain ethical standards in gin-soaked London. Pure moral principles had become practically impossible to implement because they required cooperation from institutions and individuals who were no longer capable of ethical behavior. The printer's solution was to establish internal guidelines that allowed him to work with criminal organizations while avoiding the most destructive forms of collaboration. He would print materials for illegal businesses but refused jobs involving violence against specific individuals. He provided services that supported general criminal activities but declined contracts targeting legitimate institutions directly. These compromises allowed Richardson to maintain his business and support his family while preserving some degree of moral integrity. But they also illustrate how gin addiction had forced even conscientious individuals to participate in criminal networks that they personally opposed. Richardson's experience demonstrated that moral purity had become a luxury that few people in gin-soaked London could afford. Survival required pragmatic accommodation with criminal organizations, even for individuals who recognized the destructive consequences of their choices. The printer's gradual accommodation with criminal clients paralleled broader social changes that were transforming London's entire cultural landscape. Traditional moral and religious authorities had lost influence over populations whose daily survival depended on criminal networks. New forms of cultural expression were emerging that reflected the values and perspectives of criminal organizations rather than legitimate institutions. Street ballads and popular songs began celebrating criminal figures as heroes rather than villains. Stories circulated that portrayed gin addiction as liberation from oppressive social conventions rather than personal and social destruction. Even children's games incorporated themes of violence, deception, and criminal enterprise that would have horrified previous generations. This cultural transformation wasn't simply reflecting existing social changes. It was actively accelerating the breakdown of traditional social bonds by making criminal behavior seem normal, attractive, and morally acceptable. Children who grew up hearing songs about successful criminals naturally developed different aspirations than those raised on traditional moral tales. The power of this cultural influence became clear when legitimate authorities attempted to counter criminal propaganda with their own moral messaging. Traditional religious and educational materials seemed antiquated and irrelevant compared to the immediate, exciting, and profitable alternatives offered by criminal culture. Even more disturbing was the discovery that many supposedly legitimate cultural institutions were actually controlled by criminal organizations seeking to influence public opinion. Publishers, theatre operators, and even some churches were secretly funded by criminal enterprises that used these platforms to promote values and behaviors that served their strategic interests. The result was a cultural environment where distinguishing between legitimate and criminal influences became increasingly difficult. Traditional moral authorities found themselves competing with criminal organizations that possessed superior resources, better understanding of popular psychology, and fewer constraints on their messaging strategies. By 1743, this cultural competition had been decisively won by criminal organizations in many parts of London. Entire neighbourhoods had developed value systems that were completely incompatible with traditional British moral and legal frameworks. These communities weren't simply ignoring legitimate authority. They had created alternative moral systems that actively opposed traditional values. The emergence of these alternative moral systems represented perhaps the most serious long-term threat created by the gin epidemic. Physical damage could be repaired, economic losses could be recovered, and political institutions could be reformed. But the cultural changes occurring in gin-soaked London were creating mindsets that would persist for generations even if the immediate crisis was somehow resolved. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, and one of the most perceptive social observers of his era, recognized the historical significance of what was happening in London. Defoe's journalistic background and literary skills allowed him to document social changes with unprecedented detail and analytical sophistication. Defoe's reports from this period describe a society undergoing transformation so radical that future historians would struggle to believe his accounts. He documented communities where traditional family structures had been completely replaced by criminal hierarchies. He observed neighborhoods where children learned criminal skills as systematically as previous generations had learned traditional trades. But Defoe's most important contribution was his recognition that these changes weren't temporary disruptions that would disappear when the gin epidemic ended. He understood that London was experiencing a fundamental alteration in human social organisation that would have permanent consequences for British civilization. The author's analysis suggested that gin addiction had triggered social changes that were irreversible through normal political or economic means. The communities emerging from gin-soaked London represented new forms of human organisation that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional British society. Defoe predicted that these new social forms would eventually spread beyond London to influence other British cities and possibly other European nations. He saw gin-induced social breakdown as a preview of changes that would affect all of European civilization if similar conditions developed elsewhere. The author's warnings proved remarkably prescient. Other British cities were already experiencing their own gin epidemics, and the social changes occurring in London were being replicated throughout the kingdom. Traditional social institutions were collapsing wherever gin consumption reached critical levels. International observers were also noting similar patterns in other European cities, where cheap alcohol and economic disruption had created conditions resembling those in London. The gin epidemic wasn't just a British phenomenon, it was part of broader changes affecting urban civilization throughout Europe. These international parallels suggested that gin addiction was revealing fundamental vulnerabilities in European social organisation, rather than problems specific to British culture or government. The crisis in London was providing a preview of challenges that would eventually confront all European societies as urbanisation and economic change created similar social pressures. The implications were staggering. If gin addiction could transform London so completely, what would happen when similar pressures affected other major European cities? Would traditional European civilization survive if multiple urban centres experienced simultaneous social breakdown? These questions were becoming increasingly urgent as reports arrived from other cities describing rising gin consumption and associated social problems. Amsterdam, Hamburg, and even Paris were beginning to show early signs of the patterns that had devastated London. But perhaps most terrifying was the realization that London's experience had demonstrated how quickly and completely civilized society could collapse when the right combination of pressures converged. The gin epidemic had revealed that European civilization was far more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. The transformation of London from Europe's greatest city into a criminal-controlled wasteland had taken less than 2 decades. If similar changes could occur so rapidly in Britain's most important urban centre, no European city could consider itself safe from comparable disasters. This recognition was beginning to influence international relations, as European powers realised that domestic social stability was far more precarious than traditional military and economic analyses had suggested. The balance of power between nations might shift rapidly if any major power experienced London-style social breakdown. French and Spanish observers were already calculating how they might exploit British weakness if the gin epidemic continued to spread throughout the kingdom. They were also taking defensive measures to prevent similar social breakdown in their own territories. But these defensive efforts were hampered by the reality that gin addiction exploited fundamental features of European urban civilization that couldn't be easily changed. Cities required concentrated populations, complex economic relationships, and sophisticated social institutions. These same characteristics that made urban civilization possible also made it vulnerable to the types of social breakdown occurring in London. The gin epidemic had revealed that European civilization contained the seeds of its own destruction. The same economic systems that had created unprecedented prosperity had also generated the social conditions that made gin addiction possible and profitable. The urban concentrations that had enabled cultural and technological advancement had also created populations vulnerable to rapid social contagion. James Thomson, the Scottish poet who had celebrated British prosperity in rural Britannia, found himself documenting the collapse of everything he had previously praised. Thomson's later writings from this period reveal a man struggling to understand how the civilization he had glorified could have transformed so completely and so quickly. Thomson's poetic sensibility allowed him to capture emotional and psychological dimensions of the crisis that escaped other observers. His verses described the profound sense of loss experienced by Londoners who remembered what their city had been before gin addiction transformed it into something unrecognizable. But Thomson's most powerful insights concerned the speed with which social memory was disappearing. Children who had grown up during the gin epidemic had no personal experience of functional society. They couldn't imagine alternatives to the criminal-controlled chaos they had always known. This loss of social memory meant that recovery would require more than simply eliminating gin addiction. London would need to rebuild not just institutions and economic systems, but the entire cultural knowledge base that made civilized society possible. The poet observed communities where basic social skills had been forgotten within a single generation. People no longer knew how to cooperate peacefully, resolve disputes without violence, or maintain relationships based on mutual trust and respect. These capabilities had been replaced by survival skills appropriate for criminal environments but useless for civilized society. Thomson's documentation of this cultural amnesia provided crucial evidence for understanding why the gin epidemic had been so devastating and why recovery would be so difficult. Social breakdown hadn't just damaged existing institutions, it had eliminated the knowledge necessary for rebuilding those institutions. Robert Walpole, still serving as Prime Minister despite his own compromised condition, was beginning to grasp the full scope of the crisis his administration faced. Walpole's private correspondence from 1743 reveals a leader who finally understood that the gin epidemic threatened the survival of British civilization itself. But Walpole also recognized that his government lacked the resources, authority, and moral credibility necessary for addressing a crisis of this magnitude. Traditional policy tools were inadequate for problems that had fundamentally altered the social fabric of the nation's most important city. The Prime Minister's dilemma was compounded by his realization that any effective response to the gin epidemic would require acknowledging the government's role in creating the disaster. The policies that had encouraged gin production and consumption had been implemented by his own administration and its predecessors. Political survival seemed to require maintaining the fiction that gin addiction was a temporary problem that could be solved through minor policy adjustments. But Walpole's private analysis suggested that effective solutions would require admitting massive governmental failure and accepting responsibility for unprecedented social destruction. The Prime Minister's paralysis reflected broader institutional failures that made effective response impossible. Parliament included too many members who were personally compromised by gin addiction or financially dependent on the gin trade. The civil service was staffed by officials who were either addicted themselves or corrupted by criminal organisations. Even the monarchy had been compromised by gin-related corruption and addiction. King George II's court was reportedly consuming enormous quantities of gin, and several royal advisors were suspected of maintaining financial relationships with major distilling operations. This comprehensive institutional corruption meant that British government had become incapable of governing effectively. The gin epidemic hadn't just created social problems, it had systematically destroyed the governmental capacity necessary for addressing those problems. Foreign observers were beginning to recognize that Britain was experiencing a form of state failure that created opportunities for international exploitation. French agents were already operating in London with impunity, knowing that British authorities were too compromised to interfere with foreign intelligence activities. Spanish merchants were violating trade agreements without consequence because British commercial enforcement had collapsed. Even smaller European powers were beginning to ignore British diplomatic protests, calculating that London lacked the authority and capability to enforce its international positions. The international implications were becoming clear to perceptive observers throughout Europe. Britain's gin-induced governmental collapse was creating a power vacuum that would reshape European politics for generations. Cardinal Alessandro Albani, the Pope's chief diplomatic advisor, provided perhaps the most insightful contemporary analysis of Britain's situation. Albani's position gave him access to intelligence reports from throughout Europe, allowing him to understand patterns that individual national observers might miss. Albani's correspondence describes Britain as a cautionary example of how quickly established civilizations could collapse when social cohesion was destroyed by addiction and criminal penetration of government institutions. The Cardinal saw Britain's experience as a preview of challenges that would eventually affect all European powers. But Albani also recognized opportunities for the Catholic Church to expand its influence if Protestant Britain continued to disintegrate. The Cardinal began developing strategies for filling the religious and moral vacuum created by the collapse of Anglican authority in jinn-affected areas. These strategies involved establishing Catholic missions in London neighbourhoods where traditional Protestant institutions had failed completely. Catholic priests were instructed to provide practical services like education, medical care, and dispute resolution rather than focusing primarily on religious conversion. The approach proved remarkably successful in areas where residents had lost faith in all traditional institutions. Catholic missions offered stability, moral authority, and practical assistance that Protestant churches could no longer provide effectively. But the Catholic Church's success in jinn-affected areas also revealed how completely traditional British religious and cultural identity had been destroyed. Neighbourhoods that had been Protestant for centuries were converting to Catholicism because Catholic institutions were the only ones that still functioned effectively. This religious transformation had profound political implications for a nation whose identity was built on Protestant resistance to Catholic influence. The gin epidemic was not only destroying British social institutions, it was eliminating the cultural foundations of British national identity. King George II was reportedly terrified by intelligence reports describing Catholic expansion in London's criminal districts. The monarch recognised that religious conversion in these areas represented more than individual spiritual choices. It indicated fundamental changes in political loyalty and cultural allegiance. But royal attempts to counter Catholic influence were hampered by the reality that Protestant institutions in these areas had been thoroughly compromised by gin addiction and criminal corruption. The Crown couldn't compete with Catholic efficiency without first rebuilding Protestant institutional capacity, a task that seemed impossible given existing governmental resources and authority. The religious dimension of the crisis added another layer of complexity to recovery efforts that were already overwhelmingly difficult. Effective response would require not just eliminating gin addiction and criminal control, but also rebuilding Protestant religious authority in communities that had lost faith in traditional British institutions. Mary Astell, one of England's first feminist writers, provided unique insights into how gin addiction was affecting women and family structures throughout London. Astell's focus on women's experiences revealed dimensions of the crisis that male observers often overlooked or misunderstood. Astell documented how gin addiction had created new forms of female independence that were simultaneously liberating and destructive. Women who had been economically dependent on husbands or fathers found themselves able to earn money through criminal activities. But this independence came at the cost of physical safety, social respectability, and long-term security. The writer observed that criminal organizations often provided women with opportunities for leadership and entrepreneurship that would have been impossible in traditional society. Some women had built substantial criminal enterprises that generated wealth and power far beyond anything they could have achieved through legitimate channels. But Astell also recognized that this criminal female empowerment was ultimately illusory because it depended on social breakdown rather than genuine equality. Women succeeded in criminal environments because normal social constraints had collapsed, not because underlying gender relations had improved. The writer's analysis suggested that djinn-induced social chaos had created a brief window where traditional gender roles became irrelevant, but this window would close once stable authority was re-established. Women who had gained power during the crisis would likely lose it when normal social order was restored. Astell's insights proved remarkably prescient. When government authorities eventually began implementing effective responses to the djinn epidemic, women who had achieved prominence in criminal organizations were among the first targets for elimination or marginalization. But the temporary transformation of gender relations during the djinn epidemic had lasting effects on women's consciousness and aspirations. Even after criminal opportunities disappeared, many women retained memories of independence and capability that influenced their expectations and behavior. These changed expectations created ongoing tensions in British society long after the immediate crisis had passed. Women who had experienced power and independence during the djinn epidemic were often unwilling to accept traditional subordinate roles when stable authority was re-established. The djinn epidemic had inadvertently provided British women with a preview of possibilities that wouldn't become generally available until much later in British social development. This preview created frustrations and ambitions that contributed to ongoing social tensions throughout the remainder of the 18th century. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, whose earlier correspondence had documented the epidemic's spread among the aristocracy, began focusing her attention on how djinn addiction was reshaping relationships between social classes. Lady Mary's aristocratic position provided her with unique access to both elite society and the criminal organizations that were gaining influence over elite behavior. Lady Mary observed that djinn addiction was eliminating traditional class distinctions in unexpected ways. Aristocrats who had become seriously addicted often found themselves dependent on criminal organizations that were controlled by people from much lower social backgrounds. These dependency relationships inverted traditional social hierarchies. Noble families found themselves taking orders from criminal leaders who had grown up in poverty. Wealthy merchants discovered that their businesses were controlled by former servants who had gained power through criminal enterprises. But Lady Mary also noted that these class inversions were temporary and unstable. Criminal leaders who had gained power over aristocrats often lacked the cultural knowledge and social skills necessary for maintaining long-term influence over elite society. The result was a form of social chaos where traditional class relationships had been destroyed, but no stable alternative system had emerged to replace them. Power shifted constantly between individuals and groups who lacked the institutional support necessary for establishing lasting authority. Lady Mary's observations revealed that djinn addiction hadn't just created social problems. It had eliminated the social structures that normally contained and resolved such problems. London was experiencing a form of organized anarchy, where multiple competing authorities claimed legitimacy without possessing the resources to establish stable control. This institutional vacuum created opportunities for the most ruthless and adaptable individuals to accumulate temporary power, but it also ensured that such power would remain precarious and contested. The djinn epidemic had created a social environment where no individual or organization could establish the trust and cooperation necessary for effective governance. The implications terrified thoughtful observers who understood that sustainable civilization required stable institutions and predictable social relationships. London was demonstrating that advanced urban society could collapse rapidly into a state of sophisticated barbarism that combined technological capabilities with primitive social organization. Dr. Samuel Johnson, still a relatively unknown writer at this time, was developing the intellectual framework that would later make him one of England's most important literary figures. Johnson's early experiences with djinn-soaked London provided him with insights into human nature and social organization that would influence his writing throughout his career. Johnson's private notebooks from this period reveal a young man struggling to understand how rational beings could create and perpetuate social systems that were obviously destructive to everyone involved. His observations of gin-addicted London convinced him that human nature contained fundamental irrationalities that made social collapse not just possible, but inevitable under certain conditions. The future lexicographer was particularly struck by how gin addiction had eliminated the capacity for long-term thinking that was essential for civilized society. Addicted individuals made decisions based entirely on immediate needs, creating social dynamics that spiraled toward disaster despite everyone's recognition that current trends were unsustainable. Johnson's analysis suggested that civilization required more than just intelligence and good intentions. It demanded institutional structures that could override individual short-term thinking and coordinate behavior toward long-term community benefit. Gin addiction had destroyed these structures, revealing how fragile the foundations of civilized society actually were. The young writer began developing ideas about morality, social responsibility, and human psychology that would later influence British intellectual life for generations. But these ideas were shaped fundamentally by his early exposure to London's gin-induced social breakdown. Johnson's lifelong suspicion of utopian social theories, his emphasis on practical morality over abstract principles, and his conviction that human happiness depended more on stable institutions than individual freedom all reflected lessons learned during London's darkest period. The gin epidemic was thus shaping not just immediate social conditions, but also the intellectual frameworks that would guide future British social development. The crisis was creating new ways of thinking about human nature, social organisation, and political responsibility that would influence British culture long after the immediate problems had been resolved. Meanwhile, the immediate crisis continued deepening as 1744 approached. Crime rates had reached levels that made normal urban life impossible in large areas of London. Economic activity had shifted so completely toward criminal enterprises that legitimate businesses could barely function. Government authority had collapsed so thoroughly that foreign observers were beginning to question whether Britain still qualified as a sovereign nation. If a country couldn't maintain basic order in its own capital city, could it credibly claim to govern territory or conduct international relations? These questions were becoming urgent as other European powers began testing British responses to various provocations. Military challenges, trade disputes, and territorial claims that would normally have generated strong British responses were met with weakness or incoherence that reflected domestic governmental collapse. The gin epidemic had transformed from a social problem into a national security crisis that threatened Britain's survival as an independent power. Yet the political and institutional resources necessary for addressing this crisis remained paralysed by the same addiction and corruption that had created the disaster. London's experience was revealing fundamental vulnerabilities in European civilization that no previous crisis had exposed. The speed and completeness of social breakdown suggested that urban civilization was far more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. As 1744 began, thoughtful observers throughout Europe were asking whether London's experience represented an isolated disaster or a preview of challenges that would eventually affect all European societies. The answer to this question would determine the future of European civilization itself. But finding that answer would require understanding the deeper causes of London's collapse and developing responses that addressed root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. The complexity of this challenge was becoming apparent to the few remaining officials who still possessed the clarity of mind to analyse their situation objectively. Thomas Pelham, the Duke of Newcastle, found himself in an impossible position as he watched his political coalition crumble under the weight of gin-induced corruption. Newcastle's correspondence from early 1744 reveals a desperate man trying to maintain governmental authority while surrounded by colleagues who were either too intoxicated to perform their duties or too compromised by criminal connections to be trusted with sensitive information. Newcastle's attempts to organise coherent policy responses were repeatedly sabotaged by the very people he depended on for implementation. Cabinet meetings devolved into chaotic arguments between ministers who were too drunk to follow complex discussions. Military briefings were compromised when officers shared classified information with criminal organizations in exchange for gin supplies. Even routine administrative functions became unreliable when civil servants prioritized their addiction over their professional responsibilities. The Duke's private secretary, William Murray, documented specific instances of governmental dysfunction that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Murray described cabinet meetings where ministers passed out at the conference table, diplomatic negotiations conducted by ambassadors who were visibly intoxicated, and military orders that were never delivered because the responsible officers had traded them to criminals for alcohol. Murray's records reveal how thoroughly gin addiction had penetrated every level of British government. Parliamentary debates were frequently interrupted by members who were too drunk to speak coherently. Committee hearings were postponed when chairmen failed to appear because they were incapacitated by drinking. Even routine votes were influenced by members whose judgment was impaired by constant intoxication. The administrative chaos created by official addiction had cascading effects throughout British society. Laws that were passed couldn't be enforced because enforcement agencies were dysfunctional. Court decisions were ignored because judicial authority had lost credibility. Tax collection became sporadic because revenue officials were either corrupt or incompetent. Murray's documentation of these failures provided crucial evidence for later historians trying to understand how a major European power could experience such complete governmental collapse. But at the time, his reports were largely ignored because the officials who should have acted on them were too compromised to process the information effectively. The secretary's growing frustration became evident in his private correspondence with family members living outside London. Murray wrote that he felt like he was working for a government that existed only on paper, while real authority had passed to criminal organisations that at least maintained some degree of internal discipline and effectiveness. Murray's observations were confirmed diplôme by foreigners stationed in London, who were sending increasingly alarmed reports to their home governments about British governmental dysfunction. The French ambassador, Marquis d'Argenson, wrote that Britain had become a nation governed by drunkards and criminals, while the Spanish envoy reported that British officials were so compromised by addiction and corruption that they can no longer be considered reliable partners in any international arrangement. These diplomatic assessments reflected a growing international consensus that Britain was experiencing state failure on a scale that threatened European stability. Other powers began making contingency plans for scenarios where British governmental collapse created power vacuums that needed to be filled by foreign intervention. Catherine Sedley, the Countess of Dorchester, provided unique insights into how gin addiction was affecting the royal court and the highest levels of British society. Catherine's position as a former royal mistress gave her access to palace gossip and court intrigue that revealed the extent to which addiction had compromised even the monarchy itself. Catherine's private journals describe court ceremonies where members of the royal family appeared publicly in states of obvious intoxication. She documented formal state occasions that were disrupted by drunken courtiers and official functions that devolved into chaotic drinking parties where important government business was conducted by people too impaired to understand what they were deciding. The Countess was particularly shocked by changes in court culture that had occurred over just a few years. Traditional ceremonies that had maintained their dignity for centuries were being transformed into crude displays of excess and dysfunction. Royal receptions that should have impressed foreign dignitaries instead embarrassed British representatives and damaged the nation's international reputation. Catherine's observations revealed how completely gin addiction had eliminated the social restraints that normally governed elite behaviour. Courtiers who had been models of refinement and discretion were engaging in public behaviour that would have been scandalous among common tavern patrons. The social codes that had maintained aristocratic authority were disintegrating along with everything else. But the Countess also noted that some court figures were using the general dysfunction to advance their own political ambitions. Individuals who had previously been marginal players were gaining influence by remaining relatively sober while their competitors destroyed themselves through excessive drinking. These opportunists understood that gin addiction created temporary power vacuums that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient self-control and strategic thinking. They positioned themselves as reliable alternatives to addicted officials, while secretly maintaining their own criminal connections and questionable loyalties. Catherine's documentation of court politics during this period reveals how addiction and corruption were creating new forms of political competition, where traditional qualifications like competence, integrity, and loyalty were less important than the ability to function while surrounded by dysfunction. The royal court was becoming a microcosm of broader social changes occurring throughout London, where survival and advancement depended more on adapting to chaos than on maintaining traditional standards of behaviour and performance. King George II himself was reportedly struggling with gin dependency, though palace officials continued denying these rumours, even as evidence mounted that the monarch was frequently incapacitated during state functions. Foreign ambassadors began timing their meetings with the king for early morning hours when he was most likely to be coherent. The monarch's possible addiction created a constitutional crisis that no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. If the king was unable to perform his duties due to alcoholism, who had the authority to make decisions about succession or regency? Traditional mechanisms for addressing royal incapacity had never been designed to handle addiction-related dysfunction. Palace officials developed elaborate protocols for managing situations where the king was too intoxicated to fulfill his ceremonial and governmental responsibilities. These protocols involved carefully choreographed deceptions where other officials would make decisions while maintaining the fiction that royal authority was being properly exercised. The constitutional implications were staggering. Britain was being governed through systematic deception that concealed the effective abdication of royal authority while preserving appearances that fooled no one who was paying attention. The monarchy was becoming a theatrical performance rather than a functioning institution. James Stuart, the old pretender living in exile, recognized the opportunities created by this constitutional chaos. Stuart's agents in London were reporting that British governmental dysfunction had reached levels that might make a successful restoration attempt possible for the first time since 1715. Stuart's correspondence with European allies reveals sophisticated planning for taking advantage of British weakness. The exiled claimant understood that gin addiction had eliminated many of the obstacles that had previously made Jacobite restoration attempts impossible. Traditional sources of resistance to Stuart claims had been compromised by addiction and corruption. Military officers who should have defended the Hanoverian succession were too drunk or too corrupted to mount effective opposition. Government officials who should have coordinated defensive measures were incapacitated or unreliable. Stuart's analysis suggested that a well-planned invasion might succeed not through military conquest, but through simple replacement of dysfunctional institutions with alternatives that could actually govern effectively. British resistance would be minimal because existing authorities lacked the competence and credibility necessary for organising effective defence. The Jacobite threat added another dimension of urgency to the crisis facing British authorities. They were dealing not just with domestic social breakdown, but with external enemies who were actively planning to exploit that breakdown for political advantage. Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, was particularly enthusiastic about invasion possibilities. Charles understood that gin addiction had created conditions in London that were more favourable to Jacobite restoration than any military situation since the original Stuart exile. Charles's agents were establishing contact with criminal organisations in London, offering political legitimacy and protection in exchange for support during a potential invasion. Many criminal leaders were receptive to these approaches because they recognised that their current power was precarious and dependent on continued governmental dysfunction. The prospect of Jacobite criminal alliances represented a nightmare scenario for British authorities. If Restoration forces could combine foreign military support with domestic criminal networks, they would possess capabilities that traditional British defences were completely unprepared to handle. But Charles's invasion planning revealed how thoroughly gin addiction had altered British social dynamics. The young pretender was counting on criminal organisations for support because traditional sources of political legitimacy had been destroyed by addiction and corruption. This reliance on criminal allies meant that even successful Jacobite restoration would result in a government that was fundamentally dependent on the same criminal networks that had helped destroy Hanoverian authority. Britain would be exchanging one form of compromised government for another. Dr. Archibald Cameron, Charles's personal physician and political advisor, provided medical assessments of British social conditions that influenced Jacobite strategic planning. Cameron's reports described a population so damaged by gin addiction that they would be incapable of sustained resistance to any well-organised political movement. Cameron's medical analysis suggested that gin addiction had created physiological changes in large portions of the British population that made them unsuitable for military service or effective political participation. These people had been essentially eliminated as factors in any potential political conflict. The physician's assessments were particularly devastating regarding British military capacity. Cameron estimated that gin addiction had compromised at least 60% of potential military recruits, making it impossible for British authorities to raise effective armies even if they could organise competent leadership. These medical evaluations convinced Jacobite planners that invasion success was virtually guaranteed if they could maintain reasonable operational security and avoid giving British authorities time to organise effective responses. Captain John Murray of Broughton, Charles's secretary, was coordinating intelligence operations that revealed the full extent of British vulnerability. Murray's networks included criminal organisations, corrupted officials, and addicted military personnel who were providing detailed information about British defensive preparations. Murray's intelligence reports painted a picture of comprehensive British weakness that exceeded even Jacobite expectations. Defence plans were being shared with potential enemies by officials who were either corrupted or too intoxicated to maintain proper security. Military installations were being operated by personnel who were unreliable due to addiction. Even basic governmental functions were being compromised by widespread dysfunction. The Secretary's analysis convinced Jacobite leadership that British collapse was inevitable, whether or not they attempted restoration. The question wasn't whether Hanoverian government would fall, but whether Jacobite forces could position themselves to benefit from that collapse. Murray's strategic recommendations emphasised speed and coordination rather than military strength. He argued that successful restoration would depend more on being prepared to fill power vacuums when they appeared than on defeating British forces in traditional combat. This analysis reflected broader recognition that gin addiction had fundamentally altered the nature of political conflict in 18th century Britain. Traditional military and political strategies were becoming irrelevant when social breakdown was eliminating the foundations that made organised resistance possible. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners were developing survival strategies that reflected their understanding of how completely their social world had been transformed. Elizabeth Brownlow, a seamstress living in Southwark, exemplified the pragmatic adaptations that allowed some residents to maintain relatively stable lives, despite the surrounding chaos. Elizabeth had learned to navigate London's criminal networks without becoming completely absorbed into them. She provided sewing services to both legitimate customers and criminal organisations, maintaining relationships with both communities while avoiding exclusive dependence on either. Her strategy required careful attention to the changing territorial boundaries that divided London between different criminal organisations. Elizabeth needed to understand which neighbourhoods were controlled by which groups, what services were acceptable in different areas, and how to avoid becoming caught in conflicts between competing criminal factions. Elizabeth's business model reflected broader patterns of adaptation that were allowing some Londoners to survive the crisis without completely abandoning traditional values and relationships. These survival strategies required constant vigilance and flexibility, but they offered alternatives to complete absorption into criminal networks. The seamstress had developed sophisticated methods for assessing the reliability and safety of potential customers and business partners. She could identify signs of dangerous addiction levels, recognize individuals who were likely to become violent, and avoid situations where her personal safety might be compromised. Elizabeth's skills in reading human behavior and social dynamics had been honed by years of navigating an environment where traditional social cues were unreliable and dangerous mistakes could be fatal. She had essentially become an expert in surviving urban chaos. Her success attracted attention from other women who were trying to maintain independent livelihoods without resorting to prostitution or complete criminal involvement. Elizabeth began informally teaching survival skills to other seamstresses, laundresses, and domestic workers who were struggling to adapt to London's transformed social environment. These informal networks of surviving women created mutual support systems that provided alternatives to both traditional family structures, which had been destroyed by addiction, and criminal organizations, which offered security at the cost of personal autonomy. Elizabeth's network grew to include dozens of women who shared information about safe neighborhoods, reliable customers, and emerging threats. They developed communication systems that allowed them to warn each other about dangerous situations and coordinate responses to common challenges. The Women's Survival Network began attracting attention from criminal organizations that viewed independent female networks as potential threats to their territorial control. Several criminal leaders attempted to co-opt or destroy Elizabeth's organization through various forms of pressure and intimidation. But Elizabeth's network had learned to operate with the same flexibility and adaptability that characterize successful criminal organizations. They could disperse when threatened, reform when opportunities appeared, and maintain their essential functions even under significant pressure. The survival of Elizabeth's network demonstrated that gin addiction hadn't completely eliminated the possibility of constructive social organization. Small groups of determined individuals could still create functional communities if they understood how to adapt traditional social forms to new environmental conditions. William Hogarth was documenting these survival strategies through his artistic work, but he was also developing a more systematic analysis of how London's social transformation might be reversed. Hogarth's artistic training had taught him to observe social dynamics with unusual precision, and his commercial success had given him access to all levels of London society. Hogarth's notebooks from this period reveal a man who was trying to understand the underlying patterns that governed social breakdown and recovery. He was particularly interested in identifying the specific conditions that allowed some communities to maintain stability while others collapsed completely. The artist's observations suggested that successful adaptation to gin-induced social chaos required very specific combinations of leadership, resources, and community organization. Most attempts to maintain traditional social structures failed because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. But Hogarth also identified examples of communities that had successfully evolved new forms of organization that preserved essential social functions while adapting to the realities of criminal territorial control and widespread addiction. These successful adaptations typically involved hybrid arrangements, where traditional social institutions maintain their core functions while accepting modified relationships with criminal organizations that controlled their operating environment. And there you have it, the incredible true story of how gin nearly destroyed the greatest city on earth. From Judith Dufour, strangling her own child for gin money, to criminal masterminds like Jonathan Wild controlling entire neighborhoods, we've seen how a simple tax policy spiraled into the most devastating social collapse in British history. The gin epidemic revealed just how fragile civilization really is, and how quickly an entire society can transform into something unrecognizable when the right pressures converge. London's dark chapter reminds us that the institutions we take for granted today once seemed impossible to rebuild.